Good morning. Welcome to Profile. I'm your host, Felicia Raphael, Executive Director of the Honorable Betty Weinberg-Ellerin Commission on Women in the Courts. Joining me today is Dutchess County's Senior Assistant District Attorney Nicholas LaStella. He is the Deputy Unit Chief for the Special Victims Unit and is here to discuss a number of issues and challenges prosecutors and victims face with SVU cases. Welcome, Nick.
Thank you so much, Felicia, for having me here in your studios in downtown Manhattan. It's a pleasure to be here.
It's my pleasure, and thank you for traveling in for the day.
Of course.
Just a disclaimer for our viewers, Nick and I go back a bit. We both worked as prosecutors at the Ulster County District Attorney's Office years ago, and that's how we got to know each other and become friends and colleagues. So this is really special to see you again and have a chance to discuss some issues that really need discussing. So just a little bit about you, since the program is called Profile. Just tell us a little bit about yourself and kind of how you got into prosecution.
Of course. So I grew up on Long Island in your traditional Italian-American family. We were all very close. My mother and father were both blue-collar folks. They both had full-time jobs, worked long hours. So I spent most of the time that I wasn't in school with my grandmother Angela and my grandfather Filiberto. They are, in my opinion, the most beautiful people on this planet. They loved each other dearly. They loved their families dearly. And as I get older in life, like every day that goes by, I get more and more nostalgic about the times that we spent together with my grandparents. And so that was my upbringing. I was the first child in my family to go to graduate with a 4-year bachelor's degree. I actually thought I wanted to be a social studies teacher. Turned out my wife is the one that went the teaching route, but I thought I wanted to be a social studies teacher. I quickly realized I'm a fighter, as you know, Felicia. I'm a fighter, and I just felt as though law would be a better route. I loved history. I loved government. And I just really wanted to stand up for something, even if when I started law school I wasn't sure exactly what that was at that point, but it was something, and that's what pushed me into law school.
So, if I recall correctly, you were a prosecutor in the Bronx.
Sure was.
And then Ulster County, right after the Bronx.
Yeah, and Putnam County.
And Putnam.
So I've been to a few different offices.
Okay.
Started in the Bronx. Got my feet wet in the child abuse sex crimes unit there, and I've spent over the past decade not entirely or unanimously focused on special victims, but primarily focused on special victims and violent felony offenses.
So that's what I really want to talk to you about today, are the special victims cases. So, violence against women is pervasive. You could have domestic violence-related violence,
Sure.
Stranger sex crimes. The vast majority of sex crimes, 75 to 80%, I believe, is the latest statistic, where the victim knows the perpetrator. And I guess the first question I want to ask you is, how do you evaluate the cases from the get-go? Like after the person has reported a case to law enforcement, how do you evaluate whether to go forward, and then how do you further investigate and prepare someone for that type of trial?
Sure. So I'll just say I've prosecuted a range of serious cases, from murder cases all the way, through special victims, sex abuse cases, sexual assault cases involving adults and children alike. Prosecutors are, we have to assess a case and we have to see what the proof is. Because at the end of the day, we have to prove our case. We have to win. That's our job. Our job's to do the right thing, but our job's also to win. It's important. So the way we assess a case is, we have to look at everything. What is the background of this victim? What can we see with our own eyes, right? On her body. Is she injured physically? If it's a sexual assault case, we need to hear about every little detail of what happened, where that victim was, what happened leading up to the sex crime. Was there a SANE exam done, right? What does the evidence tell us from that? In cases, involving intimate partners of domestic violence, one of the things that is common in those cases is after there's a physical assault or in conjunction with a physical assault, there's also a sexual assault because of the power dynamics. We find, let's just say we find DNA on a rape kit, right? What does that tell us? That corroborates that there was sex, right? But it doesn't give us a whole lot more. And, in those types of cases, those are the hardest ones because, anytime that the parties are known, right, it muddies the waters a little bit. If there's DNA inside of a child, that's a little different than if there's DNA inside of two otherwise consenting adults, but, because of the domestic violence incident, it was not consensual. Right. Those are different. And so these are tough cases.
So the commission I work with, one of the main issues we discuss is credibility. And it's an uncomfortable discussion because there's the credibility of who do you believe, and there's the credibility dynamic of we believe you, but you did something wrong, or we believe you didn't do anything wrong, but it's just not important enough. So there are different types of credibility issues, especially for female victims, adult female victims in particular, when a stranger is not involved. But in your experience, when you've tried a case, and we're going to talk about one in a moment, which was unbelievable, when you try a sex crime case, a non-DV sex crime case, do you feel you have a higher burden of proof in those cases?
I actually think that it's all, in most of those cases, they tend to be easier for juries to digest. When it's a stranger that is sexually assaulted by an individual who they've never seen before or have seen a couple of times but had no prior intimate relationship, juries don't struggle as much. Where it starts to get really a lot more complicated and we have to do a lot more work as prosecutors is when if it's two adults, when the parties are known, or when the victim is elderly. We tried a case together where the victim of a sexual assault, who was an elderly woman, there was absolutely, in my mind, no doubt that the person was sexually assaulted.
It was on video.
It was on video.
Police video, if I recall.
It was on video. The 911 call, the defendant was shouting at her to forcibly perform oral sex on her while she was at a stop sign in her car. He got into her car. When police got there and the body cam, his pants were pulled down. He was on top of her. And the jury ultimately, Felicia and I tried this case together, the victim was very prepared. She did a great job. Ultimately, they found the defendant guilty on some crimes, but they found him not guilty on the top two sex offense crimes. And we were worried that the defense of intoxication was going to be the defense, and it turned out that the jury could not wrap their head around one of the elements, which is that the person, we have to prove beyond a reasonable doubt that not only did this person commit a sexual assault, but they did it with the intent to satisfy their own sexual desire, right? And sexual gratification is the language that's used. And the jury just couldn't wrap their heads around that fact. She was an elderly woman, and the defense counsel brought very attractive younger women as plants into the courtroom, who they insinuated were his girlfriends. These cases are tough. The victim did an incredible job. We ultimately did get conviction at trial. It just wasn't on the top count. And we were so frustrated, I remember, after that.
It was very frustrating.
So frustrating.
And what made it even worse was not only could you hear him on the 911 call, but he followed her car for quite a distance, and her husband was in the car with her, if I recall.
Yes.
And they still didn't believe it, even with his testimony. And so that goes to, I guess, to that third credibility factor is, yes, it happened. We believe that we obviously see what happened, but we don't get it.
Right. He
did this for another reason because you don't count, because you're older.
That was the sad reality of that case. We spoke to the jury afterwards, and that's exactly what they said. And, it's tough because the law limits us as prosecutors. We have limited abilities to explain things sometimes.
Right.
And we have to present the evidence as it comes to us. And the evidence was very clearly presented. I mean, they saw everything. They heard everything. But at the end of the day, they just could not wrap their heads around
No.
around an older woman being sexually assaulted.
So on the flip side of that, and if you can't answer this, that's fine, you have the younger woman who's maybe out at a bar or maybe is out with friends. I just heard about a case, again, in Ulster County, which is not being prosecuted, but the police wouldn't even take a report, voluntary intoxication.
Yep.
And I believe there is legislation pending right now to have that loophole eliminated. New York is one of the states where if a woman in particular becomes voluntarily intoxicated, you almost cannot prove a sex offense. Can you speak a little to that and,
Sure.
and that issue, the loophole, and the problem with these young women who go out? They have a nice time. Obviously, ingesting alcohol is legal in the state of New York, as is marijuana to a certain degree.
So I had a case in New Paltz, which, as you know, is a college town. I went to New Paltz. It's a fun place. This young woman went to a bar in town. She was given a lot to drink by the defendant, who spent hours with her. Clearly, he had something in mind. She could barely walk. She was carried out of the bar by him. And there's a hill behind the bar, a grassy area,
The case, yeah.
where she was sexually assaulted. She came to it. She was actually unconscious at the time that the sexual assault began. She came to it at the very end, right as the defendant was finishing inside of her. And she knew exactly what had happened. She had been sexually assaulted, but she could not speak and she could barely walk. And so she hobbled down the hill to Main Street to try to get help. And the defendant made the critical mistake of bragging about the rape to another individual, a male who he knew in town, who happened to be walking down the street. And that individual got the female help. A rape kit was done. He cooperated, and that individual is in state prison. He had done this years prior. It wasn't a rape; it was a sexual abuse behind another establishment in New Paltz. He was given probation because in this case we had evidence. Right? We had this other. She's not a good storyteller.
Right.
Obviously, she was intoxicated. A jury's not going to find her to be a good storyteller. But we had a sober third party who was a great storyteller, and we had DNA. So in that case, we were able to get justice. But these victims, they are the storyteller at trial. They are the trial. Everything else is extra. So it's a tough situation where you have a victim who is voluntarily intoxicated because unfortunately the prosecution relies on their storytelling to a large degree.
So how do you prepare any victim of a sexual assault? And we can talk about adult victims and child victims because it's very different with children. But how do you prepare them for the reality of what can happen at a trial? And
We go through everything so thoroughly. I always tell them, you're here to tell the truth. We start with that premise,
okay.
and then we go back and we prepare thoroughly. I had a trial in January. It was a domestic violence, physical assault, sexual assault, the hardest cases that I think any special victims prosecutor has. And we were good for the physical assault. Obviously, the sexual assault is harder. And, she just did so well during the prep. Ultimately, the defendant pled when we had, I think, 11 jurors seated. He ultimately decided he wanted to plead guilty. And so it's saved her from the trial, but she was so prepared. With the facts of the case, she was ready to testify. And after he pled, she actually, unbeknownst to me, sent a really nice email to my boss, the district attorney in Dutchess County, and just thanked him for allowing me to prosecute the case with her. And she felt that she was so thoroughly prepared. It's thorough preparation. It's going through everything, the supporting deposition, the body cams, the 911 calls, the outcries, right? Text to her mother. We go through every little detail because at the end of the day, she is I'm just here to support her. Right. She is the storyteller. And, she felt confident as she could be. I think most of my victims feel confident when they go into a courtroom. But that's days and hours of preparation.
You mentioned the Dutchess County District Attorney. Is there anything in particular that Dutchess County does with
Oh, my
SVU
goodness.
cases?
So I was just in front of the Dutchess County Legislature about a week and a half ago, telling them about some of the things that Dutchess County does, which we are far and away, we are so much more advanced than, and I'm sorry to my friendly neighboring counties, but we are so much more advanced than our neighboring counties. We have so many different programs that are targeted to taking violent domestic violence offenders off the streets. We have an $850,000 a year Strive grant where, through the Department of Probation and multiple law enforcement agencies in the county, they do targeted domestic violence operations, typically overnight. They'll go to the homes of offenders. They'll see who's present. They'll see what that offender has been up to. They'll go through their phones. And oftentimes, what do we find? We find that a protected party is present. We find that they've been communicating, oftentimes in a threatening manner, to a person who a court has issued an order of protection against, and they're arrested and they're sent to prison. And those cases are generally strong. Those people are generally predicate felons, meaning that prison's mandatory on any felony conviction. And I mean, we are really just making inroads that other counties are not. We have a massive amount of resources dedicated to victims as part of that program. We help them with relocation to shelters.
Okay.
We help. Oftentimes, there's pets involved. One of the main reasons I hear why women who are battered want to stay is either for the children or because they have pets.
Exactly.
And they can't bring them anywhere, right? So we work with them to house them and their pets to get them out of those dangerous situations.
Domestic violence is such a difficult area of the law because I think a lot of people, even though there have been studies on it and we know a lot more than we did even 5 or 10 years ago of ongoing trauma, we think about famous or infamous cases of domestic violence, but how do you deal with mental health issues that the victim may have? I don't want to say flip-flopping, wanting to prosecute, not wanting to prosecute,
Yep.
Don't get him in trouble, don't send him to prison. How do you deal with that as a prosecutor, and what does the Dutchess County District Attorney's Office do to...
So we always say, and I manage a group of about 10 special victims prosecutors. You meet every prosecutor, every prosecutor. You meet every victim where they're at, right? They're going to come to you in different life experiences, different mental states, different levels of cooperation. You meet them where they're at, because if you meet them where they're at and you start that relationship there, 9 out of 10 times, if not more, they're going to get on board with the prosecution. They're going to trust you, and they're going to do what you ask of them ultimately, which is to tell their horrifying story about being physically assaulted or sexually assaulted, beaten, raped. So you have to meet them where they are. I think I credit personally my experience with working in the Bronx. I worked with marginalized communities, predominantly people of color, predominantly people from lower socioeconomic statuses. Some of these people just came to this country. They don't trust the police. They don't trust prosecutors because in their country, police and prosecutors are sometimes no better than the criminals, right? You have to meet every single victim where they're at, and build that trust from day one. If you do that, I think you're golden. I've had victims that have not been cooperative, and ultimately turned it around and were extremely cooperative. We take them where they're at, and we're always there for them. Even if they're uncooperative at first, we keep trying, we keep following up, because things change.
I think that's such an excellent approach, because I know from my own experience being a victim advocate and doing a little bit of prosecution I did on SVU cases, there are so many times when a DV victim or sex crime victim holds back information out of fear that the prosecutor isn't going to want to prosecute the case, or she will be shamed in front of a jury, or she will not be believed, whatever the case is. And I think that trust building and explaining that, you got to tell the whole story to the
Absolutely.
jury, because the juries can tell when someone's not being straight up. They can always tell when there's a piece missing. It's not difficult. You listen. They're listening, and they can tell. So, do you have any cases that are standouts, either incredible successes or terrible disappointments?
Sure. So I'll start with the successes. We've had so many successes recently. I'll start with Ulster counties, and that's where we met and worked together on cases. I had a young man. His name is Charles Berger. He sexually assaulted and ran away with his 13-year-old babysitter. Ultimately, he was located at a hotel. There was a 5.5-hour standoff with the police. He went to trial. The defense team on that case had to explain why the defendant's DNA was found on, in a rape kit. Don't want to be too graphic on the program. It was a case where they had to muddy up the victim, and they had to come up with a defense. And that defense was that the victim enjoyed using a vibrator. And that vibrator happened to belong to the defendant's wife. The vibrator never existed, let's be very clear, okay? Mm-hmm. And that, because the defendant would have consensual sex with his wife, the DNA transferred from his spouse to the vibrator, then into the child. Yeah. You can't make this up. And on that was a overwhelming conviction. It was the longest sentence ever imposed in I think the Hudson Valley for a rape. It was 56 years, which was fantastic. He deserves every day of it. He's a very big time predator and a very bad guy. The reason I wanted to bring that one up is we had a successful outcome, which is wonderful. We've had successful outcomes in so many cases. The rape shield law, it did not protect this victim. Right. The judge did an incredible job, navigating through the litigation over rape shield, but it just didn't protect this victim. She's a child. Yeah. So, I think the legislature, while the rape shield law is a good law, there's improvements that need to be made. A couple of other standout cases, a recent Dutchess County case, a 10-year-old child was raped by her HIV-positive stepfather on her 10th birthday in the city of Poughkeepsie. He was attracted to her. He liked the yellow dress she was wearing. He dragged her into a bedroom, forcibly raped her, and exposed her to HIV. Luckily, this child's brother was nearby and apprehended it. He was prosecuted. The maximum on a rape in the first degree is 25 years. He got 23 years, which is close to the max, without a trial. He pled guilty before trial. So we were able to save that victim from having to go forward with that trial. That victim has had to now go frequently to get her blood drawn, to get tested for HIV. So not only was she violated on her 10th birthday by her stepfather in the worst way imaginable, she has to regularly go for HIV screenings because she was exposed. We got a good result there. Without trial, 23 years, I think she was very happy with the result. She has turned her trauma into absolute strength. She actually now gives speeches at various events in the Hudson Valley, and she meets with children who are sexually assaulted and gives them the strength to go forward with the prosecution. She is a remarkable young woman what a beautiful family too. Mother recently emigrated from Jamaica with the offender, and with her works ridiculous number of hours as a nurse every single day. And for her to come to this country and experience this at the hands of someone that both she and her mother should have trusted is unconscionable. I got a life sentence on a grandfather who repeatedly digitally penetrated his 7-year-old granddaughter in Ulster County. He was convicted of predatory sex assault. He will not survive state prison. So we've had lots of success stories. The biggest, juries I think tend to get it right. They really do. And most of the times that's in our favor. Sometimes it's not, as we know. Right. They generally get it right. And I am such a believer in the jury system here. There are some cases where they get it wrong. The one case we spoke about, they got it wrong. Yes, we know that, right? Wrong. That we know. But it's a mixed bag. So that was, I would say, the case that I felt we should have got a different result. One other case, huge success. We had an individual drive up from Florida with the intent to murder both of his in-laws, who lived in the town of Wappinger in Dutchess County. He came here, he murdered not only both of his in-laws, but he also murdered their 12-year-old Labrador Retriever. And it was a mass shooting incident in the town of Wappinger. And, meticulously cleaned up the crime scene, took all the shell casings, for example, away.
Right.
Dug out the projectiles out of the deceased victims. Horrible case. And we were able to get, 40 to life on him.
Okay.
So he, maybe he'll get out. We don't know.
Right.
He's in his 30s. But that's a long sentence for a plea in New York State. And I know people say, oh, he should never get out. I agree with you.
Right.
But right, we had to deal with certain issues at trial. You never know what's going to happen.
Right.
40 to life is, a bird in the hand is we'll take it. We've gotten a lot of success.
That's good to hear. My last question for you. You mentioned rape shield law. Are there any other changes you would like to see in sex crimes law that you think, just off the top of your head, would improve reporting and prosecution?
Where do I begin?
We'll make it brief.
We'll make it brief. So I think a couple of things. First and foremost, orders of protection. Melanie's law has come a long way to address some of these issues. Judges are hesitant in the criminal courts to issue orders of protection for children of, let's say, a spouse who is the victim of domestic violence, if those children are not victims of a crime themselves. That creates quite the issue for these victims. And it ultimately prevents some victims from wanting to come forward because, now there's an order of protection for her, but not for the kids. And that creates just a mess in family court and a mess, practically speaking, in their lives. So that's one thing I would hope gets addressed. The 2020 reforms, bail reform, discovery reform, the people who enacted those reforms and voted for them, I think they had the best intent in mind. And with respect to bail reform, we've come a long way with amendments.
There have been changes, right?
Yeah, and especially in domestic violence, we've come a long way. Discovery reform is still a challenge.
Right.
And luckily, the courts and the judges have issued more and more guidance for prosecutors on what is the penalty if we forget to turn over one little piece of paper that is insignificant in the case, right? It started out with your case gets dismissed.
Right.
That is no longer the case, thanks to some of the changes made by Governor Hochul, but mostly due to the law that's coming out of the courts. And they're saying that's not what the legislature intended when they enacted CPL 245. Further amendments to 245 are necessary. They really are. Everyone's focused on bail reform because it's the more newsworthy of the reforms. Discovery reform is actually, in my opinion, just as problematic. For prosecutors, it's very difficult to comply with that law as written. It's just we've got so much discovery in a particular case.
Right.
It's hard to comply with that law. So some changes would be helpful.
Great. Well, I think we're out of time. I want to thank you so much for coming in.
It's my pleasure.
And we'll do this again.
Sounds good.
And as always, I want to thank everyone who's watching. Thank you so much for tuning in. And until next time, please stay safe and healthy. Bye-bye.